Over 2 billion people alive today organize their calendars around the birth of a single man from a small Roman province who left behind no writings, no verified portraits, and not a single artifact that can be conclusively linked to his name. That number alone should stop you cold. 2 billion. Not followers of an empire, not subjects of a dynasty, not citizens of a nation. Believers in one individual. And yet, when historians sit down and ask the most fundamental question possible, which is whether this man actually existed as a historical figure, the answer is far more complicated than any Sunday school lesson ever suggested. His name, as most of the world knows it, was Jesus. But in the Aramaic dialect he almost certainly would have spoken, he was Yeshua. In the Greek text that first recorded his story, he was Isis. In the Roman administrative records of the province of Judea, he may have been entirely invisible. And that tension between the most famous name in human history and the near-total silence of the contemporary record is exactly where this investigation begins. Now, before we go any further, let us be absolutely clear about what kind of inquiry this is. This is not a theological debate. Whether Jesus was divine, whether he performed miracles, whether he rose from the dead, those are questions of faith. And faith, by its very nature, operates outside the boundaries of historical methodology. What we are doing here is something far more specific and in many ways far more unsettling. We are asking what the surviving historical evidence, examined with the same critical tools, applied to Julius Caesar, to Alexander the Great, to Cleopatra, can actually tell us about a man named Jesus of Nazareth, who allegedly lived in the 1st century of the Common Era. And the methodology matters enormously. A professional historian does not begin with a conclusion and work backward. A professional historian asks what sources exist, when those sources were written, who wrote them, what those writers had to gain or lose, and whether the accounts can be independently corroborated. Apply those standards to most figures of antiquity, and you get a reasonably clear picture. Apply those same standards to Jesus of Nazareth, and you enter one of the most contested territories in all of historical scholarship. Consider the scale of the problem. Jesus allegedly lived and preached in Judea during the reign of the Roman Emperor Tiberius, roughly between the years 26 and 36 of the Common Era. The Roman Empire was, by the standards of the ancient world, a bureaucratic machine. Romans counted things. They taxed things. They recorded census data, military movements, judicial proceedings, and provincial disturbances. Pontius Pilate, the Roman prefect who allegedly ordered the crucifixion, was a real historical figure confirmed by multiple independent sources, including a limestone inscription discovered at Caesarea Maritima in 1961 that bears his name and title. The infrastructure of the story is historically verifiable. The central character, however, is another matter entirely. Here is what makes this question so intellectually fascinating and so genuinely difficult. The absence of contemporary documentation is not, by itself, proof that someone did not exist. The ancient world was overwhelmingly illiterate. Most people who lived remarkable lives left no written trace whatsoever. A wandering preacher in a backwater province of the Roman Empire would not automatically generate official paperwork. Historians are well aware of this. The question is not whether silence proves absence. The question is whether the specific pattern of silence surrounding Jesus of Nazareth is what we would expect if he existed, or whether it points towards something more complicated. The first written accounts of Jesus do not come from eyewitnesses. The letters of Paul, which are the earliest Christian writings that survive, were composed roughly 20 years after the crucifixion. And Paul himself explicitly states that he never met Jesus during his lifetime. The Gospels, the 4 narrative accounts of Jesus' life and ministry found in the New Testament, were written between approximately 70 and 100 of the Common Era, meaning the earliest of them appeared at least 4 decades after the events they describe, written in Greek by authors whose identities remain debated by scholars to this day. And the non-Christian sources, the Roman and Jewish writers, who might have recorded an independent account of this figure, can be counted on one hand, and every single one of them comes with serious questions attached. This is the landscape that historians must navigate. Not a simple story, not a simple silence, but a complex, layered, deeply contested body of evidence that has been argued over by scholars for centuries and shows absolutely no sign of resolution. But the most shocking truth is what the historical record does not contain. So let us begin where the evidence actually begins. Not with the Gospels, not with Rome, but with a man who never met Jesus and said so openly. Paul of Tarsus wrote his letters somewhere between the years 48 and 64 of the Common Era. These are the earliest surviving Christian documents in existence, predating the Gospel of Mark by at least 2 decades. And here is what makes Paul so historically significant. He is not writing theology in a vacuum. He is writing to real communities, addressing real disputes, referencing real people. In his letter to the Galatians, Paul explicitly states that he traveled to Jerusalem and met James, whom he describes as the brother of the Lord. In his first letter to the Corinthians, he recounts receiving a tradition about the Last Supper and the resurrection appearances that he says was passed on to him. Scholars date this tradition to within just a few years of the crucifixion itself, making it among the earliest testimony we possess about Jesus. Now, Paul's letters do not read like a biography. He shows almost no interest in the details of Jesus' earthly life. No parables, no miracles, no Sermon on the Mount. What Paul cares about is the risen Christ, the theological meaning of the crucifixion, and the communities forming around that belief. Critics of the historical Jesus have seized on this silence, arguing that Paul's lack of biographical detail suggests there was no historical figure to describe. But mainstream historians push back on this interpretation firmly. Paul's silence on biographical detail is not unusual. Ancient letter writers did not typically rehearse the life story of a shared religious figure to audiences who already knew it. What matters is that Paul refers to Jesus as a real human being who was born of a woman, lived under Jewish law, had a brother named James, was crucified, and died. These are not the references of someone describing a purely mythological entity. The 4 Gospels present a different kind of challenge entirely. Mark, the earliest of them, was composed around the year 70 of the Common Era, roughly 40 years after the crucifixion. Matthew and Luke followed, probably in the 80s, both drawing heavily on Mark and on a now-lost source that scholars call Q, from the German word Quelle, meaning source. John's Gospel was composed last, around 90 to 100 of the Common Era, and stands apart from the other 3 in both style and theological emphasis. None of these texts were written by eyewitnesses in the direct sense. The names attached to them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, were assigned by early Christian tradition, and scholars debate whether those attributions are accurate. What the Gospels are is a collection of oral traditions, written accounts, and theological interpretations assembled decades after the events they describe, in Greek, by communities scattered across the Roman world. Does that make them useless as historical evidence? Absolutely not. Historians routinely work with sources written long after the events they describe. What it means is that the Gospels must be read critically, with an understanding of their purpose and their limitations. They are not neutral reports, they are proclamations of faith. But embedded within them are details that carry the texture of historical memory, specific place names, specific political figures, specific social tensions that align with what we independently know about first-century Judea. Then there are the non-Christian sources, and this is where things get genuinely complicated. The 2 most cited are Tacitus and Josephus, and both require careful handling. Tacitus was a Roman historian writing around the year 116 of the Common Era. In his annals, while describing the Emperor Nero's persecution of Christians following the Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE, he writes that the name Christian comes from Christus, who was executed by order of the procurator Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. This passage is considered by virtually all mainstream historians to be authentic. Tacitus was not a Christian sympathizer. He describes Christianity as a destructive superstition, which is precisely why his testimony carries weight. He had no reason to invent a historical Jesus. What he records is consistent with the gospel accounts of a crucifixion under Pilate during Tiberius's reign, and he appears to be drawing on Roman administrative records or the testimony of Christians he encountered. Josephus is more complicated. Flavius Josephus was a first-century Jewish historian who wrote extensively about the political and religious landscape of Judea. He mentions Jesus in 2 places in his work Antiquities of the Jews. The first, known as the Testimonium Flavianum, is the longer passage, and it has been at the center of scholarly debate for centuries. In its current form, The passage praises Jesus as a wise man, if indeed one ought to call him a man, refers to him as the Christ, and describes his resurrection as a fulfillment of prophecy. The problem is obvious. Josephus was Jewish, not Christian, and these words read like Christian interpolation, additions inserted by later copyists into Josephus's original text. The consensus among scholars today is that the passage has been tampered with, but that a genuine core reference to Jesus almost certainly existed in the original. A reconstructed version, stripping out the clearly Christian additions, would leave a neutral reference to Jesus as a wise man who gathered followers and was crucified under Pilate. The second reference in Josephus is less disputed. It describes the execution of James, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ, a brief, matter-of-fact mention that most scholars accept as authentic. Taken together, what does this evidence actually tell us? It tells us that by the early 2nd century, both Roman and Jewish writers were aware of a figure named Jesus or Christus, who had been executed under Pontius Pilate, who had gathered followers and whose movement had spread significantly. It tells us that Paul, writing within 2 decades of the crucifixion, treated Jesus as a real historical person with a family, a death, and a specific historical context. And it tells us that the Gospels, whatever their theological agenda, are built around a figure placed in a historically verifiable time and place, surrounded by historically verifiable people and institutions. So the historical record has spoken, at least as far as mainstream scholarship is concerned. A man named Jesus, or Yeshua, walked the roads of 1st century Judea, gathered followers, and was executed by crucifixion under the authority of Pontius Pilate, most likely between the years 30 and 33 of the Common Era. That much the evidence supports. But here's where the story becomes something far larger than any single historical question. Because the moment you move beyond the bare bones of his existence, you enter a landscape of extraordinary diversity, where different traditions, different communities, and different centuries have each constructed their own understanding of who this man was, what he meant, and whether he was anything more than a man at all. The Gnostic texts offer one of the most striking alternative windows into early Christianity, and for centuries they were almost entirely lost to history. Then, in December of 1945, an Egyptian farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman was digging near the cliffs of Jabal al-Tarif, not far from the town of Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, when his mattock struck a sealed clay jar. Inside were 13 leather-bound papyrus codices containing more than 50 texts, written in Coptic, dating to roughly the 4th century, but almost certainly translated from earlier Greek originals. These were the Gnostic Gospels, texts like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and the Gospel of Truth, and they presented a version of Jesus that the councils of the early church had deliberately excluded from the canonical scriptures. In these texts, Jesus is not primarily a sacrificial savior who dies for human sin. He is a revealer, a teacher of hidden knowledge, of gnosis, who comes to awaken the divine spark that sleeps within every human being. The Gospel of Thomas, which many scholars date to the 1st or 2nd century, contains no birth narrative, no miracles, no resurrection story. It is simply a collection of sayings attributed to Jesus, 114 of them, and some of those sayings have no parallel in the canonical Gospels at all. One of them reads, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you." That is not the theology of Paul. That is something considerably older and considerably stranger. And it reminds us that early Christianity was not a single unified movement, but a sprawling, contentious, deeply diverse collection of communities, each claiming the authority of Jesus for its own vision. Then there is the Islamic perspective, which is often overlooked in Western discussions of this question, and which deserves serious attention. In the Quran, Jesus, known as Isa, is mentioned by name more times than the Prophet Muhammad himself. He is described as a prophet of the highest rank, born of a virgin, capable of miracles, and destined to return at the end of time. The Quran explicitly affirms his historical existence and his significance. What it firmly rejects is his divinity and his crucifixion. Surah 4:1-7 states that the people did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, but it was made to appear so to them. For more than 1.5 billion Muslims in the world today, Jesus is a revered and real historical figure. Simply not the figure that Christian theology describes. this is not a dismissal of Jesus. It is, in its own way, one of the most powerful testimonies to the enduring weight of his presence in human history. That a religion founded 6 centuries after his death, in a different land, speaking a different language, still felt compelled to address him directly and at length. The scholarly consensus, as it stands today, is clear on the question of existence and carefully agnostic on the question of identity. The overwhelming majority of historians and biblical scholars, including many who are not themselves religious, affirm that a historical Jesus existed. Figures like Bart Ehrman, who describes himself as an agnostic and has spent decades critiquing the supernatural claims of Christianity, nonetheless writes with conviction that Jesus of Nazareth certainly existed. The mythicist position, the argument that Jesus was entirely invented with no historical basis, remains a fringe view held by a small minority of scholars and largely rejected by the academic mainstream, not for theological reasons, but because the evidence, fragmentary as it is, points consistently in the other direction. What remains genuinely and perhaps permanently open is the question of what that historical existence actually means. Was he a Jewish apocalyptic preacher who believed the end of the world was imminent? Was he a social revolutionary challenging the structures of Roman power? Was he a healer and wonder worker whose reputation spread because he offered something the temple establishment could not? Was he, as his earliest followers claimed with absolute certainty, the Son of God raised from the dead? History, as a discipline, cannot answer that last question. It was never designed to. The tools of the historian can establish context, evaluate sources, and weigh probabilities. They cannot measure faith, and they cannot enter the realm of the transcendent. What history can tell us is this: whatever this man was, the world has never recovered from him. Within 3 centuries of his death, the empire that executed him had adopted his name. Within 2 millennia, roughly a third of the entire human population, more than 2 billion people, identifies as Christian. His teachings have shaped legal systems, inspired revolutions, justified wars, funded hospitals, built universities, and generated more art, music, literature, and philosophy than perhaps any other single source in the history of civilization. His words have been used to liberate the oppressed and, in the hands of others, to oppress them. He has been claimed by the powerful and by the powerless alike. He has been painted as a blonde-haired European, a dark-skinned revolutionary, a cosmic deity, and a wandering peasant teacher. Every age has looked at him and seen something it needed, and the debate has never stopped. It did not stop when Constantine converted. It did not stop when the Nicene Creed was written.